Carthage, the Lost Empire. Founded by Phoenician settlers, it grew from a small outpost into a mighty city bestriding the western Mediterranean. According to tradition, a Tyrian princess named Dido fled Tyre and established Carthage around the 9th century BCE. In the famous founding myth, Dido's people cunningly obtained land from the local Libyans by asking for only as much area as an ox hide could cover. They then cut a single hide into a long strip and encircled a hilltop. Hence, the citadel was named Byrsa, meaning hide. The story symbolically highlights the shrewdness often attributed to the Carthaginians by the later Greeks and Romans, and in fact, Carthaginians themselves celebrated Queen Dido's legacy. So long as Carthage stood, she was revered as a founding divinity. It is from this humble and rather ingenious beginning that Carthage in Punic, or Carthage in our tongue meaning new city, rapidly expanded. By leveraging their Phoenician heritage of seafaring and commerce, the Carthaginians established dominance over surrounding peoples. Over centuries, Carthage developed into the preeminent maritime power of the western Mediterranean. It planted colonies or trading posts along North African coastlines, in southern Iberia, on Mediterranean isles like Sardinia and Corsica, and they even ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that being the Strait of Gibraltar in modern terminology. And by the 6th to 4th centuries BCE, Carthage controlled an extensive trade network and an empire of client territories. This brought immense wealth, but also clashes with Greek colonists, and later, the Romans. Despite frequent wars, Carthage's core city and culture flourished for some 700 years. Its population swelled. Ancient estimates claim hundreds of thousands of residents, and it became a cosmopolitan hub where Punic, Berber, Greek, and later even Italian influences met. Yet Carthage always maintained a distinct identity rooted in Phoenician language and traditions. But crucially, much of what we know about Carthage comes from Greek and Roman observers, and they were often adversaries in war. So our sources are biased. Romans in particular portrayed Carthaginians as treacherous or cruel, but they also provide invaluable detail. Archaeology and Punic inscriptions complement these accounts, and when we put them all together, we gain a richer picture of what Carthaginian life was actually like. And so in the sections that follow today, we will explore together Carthage's religion, daily life, social organization, their values, their economy, their art, and their intellectual pursuits, and will cross-reference them with contemporary Greek and Roman practices. What we have left is a picture of a vibrant and wealthy society that, while sharing a common ancient Mediterranean framework, developed its own unique cultural traits. So let's go together, and we can go on a bit of a deep dive into that culture of ancient Carthage. But let me welcome you to the channel first. If you are one of those who are yet to hit the subscribe button, or perhaps you're new to the channel, I invite you to do so, and leave your thoughts in the comments down below. It all helps in the algorithm. You'll also notice there are no ads throughout this whole video, as well as all of the other videos on this channel. An uninterrupted experience brought to you by the generous contributions of those on YouTube memberships and Patreon. If you would like to become a supporter, there are links in the pinned comment and video description. But let's all get nice and relaxed now, and we can begin. Nice and slow, as always. Of course, it's kind of difficult to know where to start. I'll admit that straight out of the gate, but I think it's best that we start with a bit of word about society in general. And of course, we're going to cross-reference that society with government. You see, the society of Carthage was highly stratified, yet it was politically innovative, functioning as an oligarchic republic. In place of kings beyond the legendary founders, of course, Carthage was governed by elected officials and councils. At the head were two suffets, that is from a Punic term for judge, who served annually in a role akin to a dual chief magistrates or consuls. These suffets and the elite senate directed policy, while an assembly of citizens had a role in important decisions too. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, comparing institutions, actually praised Carthage's system as one of the best non-Greek governments. Of course, you wouldn't find him saying it was better than a Greek government, but he does also note that the Carthaginian populace remained remarkably loyal to their constitution, with no notable civil strife or tyranny disrupting it. And indeed, Carthage's political stability was exceptional in a world where many city-states fell to coups or despots. Aristotle likened the Carthaginian constitution to Sparta's in its mix of elements. Carthage had councils of elders, analogous to the Spartan Gerousia, and a body of elite magistrates, that is the 104, similar of course to the Spartan ephors. But uniquely, Carthage did not restrict its top officials to a hereditary lineage. Instead, families that achieved distinction could attain high office. Now, what did this do? Well, basically, it provided a meritocratic outlet within the aristocracy. And that was something that Aristotle even had to admit that was an improvement over the rigid Spartan tradition. But despite these balances, Carthaginian government leaned towards the oligarchic. Wealth and noble birth, they mattered quite a lot in politics. Aristotle observed that Carthage chose its magistrates based both on merit but also wealth, a trait somewhat inclining to oligarchy, since it was believed a poor man would lack the leisure to govern well. Important officers could even be purchased, a practice quite abhorrent to the Romans, but pretty much accepted in Carthage. Polybius, a Greek historian of the 2nd century BCE, remarks that, quote, "Among the latter Carthaginians, nothing is reputed infamous that is jointed with gain," whereas the Romans shunned personal profit in public office. This difference in political ethics was pretty stark. Roman writers actually accused Carthaginian leaders of avarice and corruption, encapsulated in the Latin proverb Punica fides, or Punic faith, meaning treachery or bad faith in general. While certainly colored by hostility, it certainly seems that way, such comments do show that Carthage had a reputation in the ancient world for hard bargaining, but also pragmatism in statecraft. Still, Carthage's institutions generally kept the state stable and prosperous for centuries. Polybius notes that originally Carthage's constitution was as well designed as Rome's, blending aristocratic and democratic features, though by his time he felt that it had degenerated towards that cursed oligarchy. But what about socially? Well, socially Carthage was dominated by a wealthy aristocracy of landowners, merchants, and ship owners, effectively noble merchant princes. Major clans, such as the Magonids in earlier times or the Barkids in the 3rd century BC, held great sway. Oh, and by the way, the Barkids, that was the family of Hamilcar Barca, by the way. Now, these families led trade ventures, commanded armies, and patronized grand building projects. Beneath them was a class of ordinary citizens, though, small traders, artisans, farmers, who had limited political voice, but could be called to the assembly or serve in local militias. There was also a substantial population of laborers, foreigners, and of course, enslaved people. Many Libby Phoenicians, people of mixed Phoenician and North African Berber descent, lived in Carthage's territories and were integrated as a lower social stratum. They often supplied the agricultural workforce and foot soldiers for the army too. Indigenous Berber, that is, Numidian and Libyan tribes outside of the city, were subjugated or allied. Carthage exacted tribute from them, often grain or livestock, but they also traded and culturally mingled with these neighbors over time. The subject cities and allies of Carthage had various statuses of their own. Older Phoenician colonies, like Utica, remained semi-autonomous allies, while newer settlements were more directly under Carthage's control. The empire was not tightly centralized. Instead, Carthage often allowed local governance in exchange for loyalty, tribute, and exclusive trade rights. This loose hegemony worked well in peacetime, but under stress it could fracture. Take this as an example. Restive mercenaries and oppressed Libyan peasants rebelled in the mercenary war after 241 BCE, and that's just one instance. But still, Carthage generally managed a stable social order by concentrating decision-making among its elite and co-opting or coercing other groups as needed. Let's look at one noteworthy feature of Carthaginian society. That is the existence of clubs or societies called misre, as hinted by Aristotle. These were dining clubs or fraternities of the elite, where members shared common meals. Now, if you've watched any of my videos on the Spartans, you might be thinking of the syssitia, the common messes, and they were kind of similar to that. They were there to foster camaraderie among the nobility, and likely helped unify leading families around shared cultural practices. Such clubs might have also had a religious or charitable aspect. The prevalence of mercantile wealth also meant Carthaginians, more than Romans, were an urbane, cosmopolitan people. Fluent in multiple languages, too, many of them. One example, let's look at Hannibal. He famously spoke Greek and Latin fluently. At home and in port cities abroad, and comfortably dealing with foreigners for profit, you could find Carthaginians utilizing these skills. Now, this stood in contrast to the more insular Roman Republican aristocrat, who prided himself on rustic agricultural virtues, and initially viewed overseas trade with quite a bit of suspicion. In governance, Carthage did have mechanisms of accountability. Military generals, for instance, answered to the council of 104 judges. A general who lost a major battle or campaign might face a harsh punishment. In some extreme cases, Carthage executed or even crucified commanders for failure. Now that's a grim practice. It certainly shows the premium placed on success. Now cross-reference that with the Romans. We use this word crucifixion. Roman citizens you weren't allowed to crucify them. It was against the law. Crucifixion was only meant for the lowest of the low. If you've watched my video on the history of crucifixion, you'll know the details, but it's interesting that Carthage would be doing that to their own generals, their own people. Now let's look at an example. After a catastrophic naval defeat in the First Punic War, which was against Rome, the commander Hanno was crucified upon returning home, scapegoated for losing Sicily and other overseas possessions. This ruthless accountability, while brutal, of course, just shows Carthage's practical and results-driven political culture. Of course, by comparison, Rome seldom executed its failed generals. They preferred exile or political disgrace, which Romans saw as a moral distinction. But nevertheless, Carthaginians believed such stern measures were necessary to preserve the state in the most direst of times. For most of its history, Carthage's system functioned effectively, allowing it to survive external threats and internal tensions until the very end. Even during the Second Punic War, when factionalism between the expansionist Barcid family and the peace-favoring Hanno faction ran high, the constitutional framework endured. Only the final Roman siege in 146 toppled Carthage's political structure, physically annihilating the city, and with it all of its institutions. Well, of course, I can't really go past any talk about culture, especially in the ancient world, without mentioning religion and ritualism. Of course, religion, like everywhere else, pervaded Carthaginian culture. It blended Phoenician deities with unique local practices. You see, the Carthaginians worshipped a pantheon inherited from their Phoenician forebears, chief among them the god Baal Hamon and the goddess Tanit. Baal Hamon, often identified by Greeks and Romans with Kronos or Saturn, was revered as the city's patron, a sky and fertility god. His consort, Tanit, whom the Greeks likened to Juno or Artemis, was a motherly and protective deity, often called Tanit Pene Baal, Tanit, the face of Baal, that is. Numerous inscriptions and temple stelae invoke Tanit and Baal Hamon together, attesting to their primacy. Tanit, in particular, became a uniquely Carthaginian goddess over time. Her symbol, I'm sure you're familiar with, a stylized female figure or trapezoidal form with outstretched arms. It's quite ubiquitous in Carthaginian art. These deities reflected a fusion of Phoenician religion with North African influence. For instance, some scholars see Tanit as evolving from the Punic adaptation of a Berber goddess, plus aspects of Phoenician Astarte. Carthaginian religion was ritualistic and sacrificial. Like other ancient peoples, they offered animal sacrifices to gain divine favor. We're talking sheep, cattle, doves, the usual thing. Temples and outdoor sanctuaries dotted Carthage. These outdoor sanctuaries were called Tophets, by the way. But the most controversial aspect of Carthaginian worship, highlighted quite relentlessly by the Greek and Roman sources, was the alleged practice of child sacrifice in times of crisis. Classical authors describe, with a great deal of horror, ceremonies in which infants or children were offered by fire to Baal Hamon, whom they call Kronos or Moloch. Diodorus Siculus recounts that during a dire war crisis, the Carthaginians, believing they'd angered the god by substituting lower-class infants for their own, selected 200 of the most noblest children and sacrificed them publicly. Of course, and also others, too, were added into the mix, under suspicion of sacrifice themselves voluntarily, in a number not less than 300. He vividly describes a Bronze Age statue of Kronos with outstretched arms, dropping the child into a fiery pit. Such accounts, corroborated by Clearchus, and later by Plutarch and Tertullian, convey the outsider's revulsion and have cast Carthage as a byword for cruel rites. Now you could pass it all off as slander, but modern archaeology does confirm that Carthaginians did devote infants and young children to the gods, though whether this was a regular thing or something done in extraordinary crises is quite often debated still. At Carthage's Tophet, that special open-air sanctuary, thousands of urns with cremated remains of infants and some small animals have been discovered, and many urns bear descriptions to Tanit and Baal, suggesting these burials were votive offerings. So it would seem that Carthaginians would sometimes vow their child to the gods in hope of divine aid, for example during sieges, plagues, or to fulfill a prayer. In some cases, a substitute sacrifice of a lamb was made instead of a child. Infant animal bones have been found in a minority of urns, but in many instances, the child was genuinely sacrificed and then cremated and interred with reverence. The practice may have been more common among the elite, offering their most precious offspring in extremis as a demonstration of piety. Of course, it appalled the Greco-Roman observers, for by their time child sacrifice had long been abandoned or mythologized in their own cultures. In Greek myth, Agamemnon's attempted sacrifice of Iphigenia, or in the Bible, Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, are echoes of a practice largely past. To the Romans, who prided themselves on family and had outlawed human sacrifice, Carthage's rites were seen as proof of Punic cruelty. Yet it is worth noting that Carthaginians likely viewed it as a solemn, if tragic, duty to the gods when demanded. They even had a tradition that after a sacrifice, the parents would abstain from tears or wailing to avoid spoiling the offering, a stoicism that later writers like Plutarch recount with shivers. But not all Carthaginian religious life was so grim. In daily practice, Carthaginians frequented temples of many gods. They worshipped Melkart, the patron of Tyre, whom the Greeks identified with Heracles. Carthage honored Melkart with at least one prominent temple, reflecting ongoing ties to Tyre. Eshmun, a Phoenician god of healing, akin to Asclepius, had a major shrine atop the Byrsa hill. Egyptian influence brought veneration of Osiris and Isis into the Punic world. Indeed, an inscription calls a Carthaginian priest, quote, priest of Osiris, who is lord of the dead, suggesting some syncretism, and a beautiful sarcophagus lid from Carthage even depicts a robed woman labeled as priestess of Isis. The city's religious milieu was likely diverse and tolerant of different cults, as long as they did not threaten state order, that is. They even had a famed sanctuary of Aphrodite on Cape Bon and a Poseidon temple in the vicinity, illustrating the adoption of pan-Mediterranean deities. Public religious festivals were important too. The Carthaginians held feasts, processions, and offerings on holy days. One can imagine the harbor and temples decorated for rituals dedicated to Tanit or Baal, with music of flutes and cymbals. And indeed, one Carthaginian voyage account, that is, Hanno's Periplus, mentions hearing mysterious drum and cymbal sounds during a ritual on an African shore, suggesting how music and dance featured in Punic worship. Like the Romans, Carthaginians consulted omens and employed priests for divination. They might inspect the entrails of sacrificial animals or observe celestial signs to guide decisions. The late Punic stelae often carry engraved symbols of Tanit and short prayers, indicating a personal piety among people making vows for childbirth, safe voyages, etc. And so in comparing Carthaginian religion with the Greco-Roman practice, we can see some clear parallels. Libations of wine, incense burning, processions, dedication of votive gifts were common to all. The Carthaginians offered thanks to the gods for victory or prosperity just as the Romans did. But Carthage's retention of child sacrifice set it starkly apart in the eyes of contemporaries. I mean, let's be honest, it's pretty hard to ignore. Roman writers claimed that even in Carthage's final agonies in 146, some parents killed their children rather than see them fall into Roman hands, a chilling echo of their sacrificial ethos. Though, once again, remember this might be war propaganda. But it is telling that once Rome conquered Carthage, these practices ceased. By the imperial era, North African worship of Baal Hamon continued under the guise of the Roman god Saturn, but this time without human offerings. The Christian writer Tertullian, himself from Carthage, later thanked Rome for quashing the sacred infanticide of his Punic ancestors. So, Carthaginian religion, it was certainly a potent mixture of devotion and dread, deeply traditional, yet adaptive, and of course, it was central in both private and public life. Well, I think that's enough about the human sacrifice. Don't want to turn anybody off. Let's just have a look into what was it like to live in Carthage during its heyday, the situation on the ground. Ancient descriptions and archaeological evidence piece together that picture, and it's a picture of a bustling, affluent city, even with a bit of a cosmopolitan flair. The city of Carthage itself spread over a peninsula with excellent harbors divided into various quarters, residential districts, markets, industrial areas, and of course the citadel on Byrsa Hill. Urban life in Carthage was likely as lively and crowded as Alexandria or Rome. In fact, there is one striking detail given by Appian, in that many houses in Carthage were multi-storied, tightly clustered buildings, 6 stories high, lining the steep streets climbing the Byrsa. It's hard to imagine 6-story buildings back in ancient times, but believe it or not, they'd certainly worked it out. After all, it's a city. These towering apartment blocks, I suppose we could call them, perhaps the world's earliest skyscrapers in a sense, suggest a high urban population density, but they also imply a certain standard of living. Even common folk had multi-room dwellings stacked atop each other, and landlords, well, they could profit by renting out floors. This is quite comparable to the later Roman insulae in cities like Rome and Antioch. It indicates that, like Rome, Carthage faced the challenges of a large urban populace. Fire, sanitation, water supply via aqueducts or cisterns, and of course the need for public amenities. Carthage's streets would have been filled with a bit of a polyglot crowd. The common language, of course, was Punic, a later form of Phoenician, written in a Semitic alphabet. But due to trade, many Carthaginians also spoke Greek, and later some even learned Latin. In Carthage's markets, one might hear traders bargaining in all 3 tongues. Carthaginians dressed in fashions that mixed Phoenician and local styles. Men of status often wore long, robe-like tunics with fringes, akin to Eastern Mediterranean garb, sometimes with decorative dyes like Tyrian purple, and that was expensive. Stele carvings show men with trimmed beards and hair wearing filigrees or amulets. And as for the women, they likely wore flowing gowns and veils. Depictions of the so-called priestess figure show a tiered, colorfully patterned garment and ornate earrings. And don't forget the jewelry. That was popular too. Gold and silver rings, necklaces, and ivories have been found, attesting to personal adornment. Compared to Greek women, Carthaginian women may have enjoyed somewhat more public presence. I mean, some Punic women served as priestesses or temple officials, for instance, though society was generally patriarchal. An interesting custom for the Foundation legend: when widowed Queen Dido chose to remain loyal to her late husband and ultimately took her own life to avoid remarriage, she set an ideal of marital fidelity, and that was something that the Carthaginians admired. In one version of the tale, Dido's act was so revered that the Carthaginians instituted an annual memorial, and perhaps normative expectations for women's chastity and loyalty. Of course, family life in general was centered on the household. Fathers held authority, but mothers, like the proverbial brave Carthaginian woman, could exert influence, especially in religious vows, since they bore children to be dedicated. Children were cherished, yet, as noted, could be symbolically returned to the gods. It's a nice way to put it, isn't it? Well, education for boys of the elite likely included learning languages, literature, and certainly training in commerce and naval skills. Unlike Greek city-states that prized gymnastics and rhetoric, Carthaginians placed more value on practical apprenticeship. A young Hannibal went not to school, but to war camps with his father in Spain. However, when circumstance allowed, Carthaginians did appreciate intellectual learning. Some aristocrats hired Greek tutors for their children, especially during the Hellenistic era when Greek culture had spread. As for the girls, they were most likely educated at home in more domestic skills. Some, especially of the noble families, learned to read Punic and participate in temple rituals, but this was probably rare. Now, what about meals and cuisine? Well, pretty much the same as other Mediterranean diets. Bread from wheat or barley, olive oil, wine, fruits, fish, and lamb, too, were staples. The North African hinterland was extremely fertile, so grain porridge and bread were readily available. Carthaginians likely introduced or refined various viticulture and orchard techniques. Notably, the Carthaginian agronomist Margot wrote an extensive treatise on farming, covering viticulture, olive cultivation, beekeeping, etc., the whole gamut, and the Romans esteemed that, so much after conquering Carthage, they commissioned its translation into Latin. Now this suggests Carthaginians had a sophisticated agricultural science underpinning their cuisine and economy. Meats like beef, goat, and various game were eaten on special occasions, often roasted for religious feasts. But they also enjoyed seafood, of course, being a maritime people. Fish and shellfish were sold in markets. Fish salting installations have actually been found in Punic settlements. A delicacy could have been garum, this kind of fermented fish sauce which Phoenicians likely passed to Carthage and later to Rome. Social customs in Carthage valued community and solidarity among kin and peers. Feasting clubs, that comradeship that Aristotle mentions, imply that men regularly dined together beyond family, fostering those social bonds. Drinking of wine was common, but probably tempered by Phoenician propriety. Carthaginians had a reputation for sobriety and austerity in some Greek accounts, perhaps an echo of their strict child-offering rites and discipline of their military officers. Yet others portray them as a decadent Eastern culture in love with luxury. It's a conflicting image that shows up in Roman literature. While Romans castigated that Punica fides, they also begrudgingly admired the Carthaginian dedication to duty, as exemplified by Regulus, a Roman captive, observing that Carthaginians tortured him to death with unwavering resolve, a gruesome anecdote from the First Punic War. But in daily values, Carthaginians likely cherished cunning, resourcefulness, and endurance. Hannibal's own character, as described by Livy, includes both tremendous self-control, as he could withstand heat, cold, and abstain from excess, and also craftiness in war. These traits were probably honed from youth. There is a famous story that illustrates the installation of virtues. Hannibal, as a boy, swore an oath at the altar at his father's behest that he would never become a friend of the Roman people. This oath of eternal hatred to Rome, taken while his father Hamilcar sacrificed to the gods, became a defining cultural motive, showing how Carthaginians of one generation imparted to the next a fierce commitment to their nation's cause, in this case, vengeance against the Romans. But another notable aspect of daily life was commerce, which was not just an economic activity, but it seems to be a cultural one too. Carthaginians were merchant sailors from early on. A Carthaginian youth might join a trading ship's crew, visiting ports in Sardinia, Sicily, Iberia, and beyond to learn the ropes of the trade. And honesty in trade, that was valued pragmatically. Herodotus recounts a fascinating example of Carthaginian traders engaging in silent barter with natives on the Atlantic coast of Africa. In this account, the Carthaginians offloaded goods on the beach, retreated, and signaled with smoke. Locals then left gold and withdrew, and the exchange proceeded without words, until both sides were satisfied, neither party acting unjustly, the Carthaginians not touching the gold until it equaled their goods, and the locals not touching the goods until the gold was taken. This tale, whether it's true or not, portrays Carthaginians as fair but cautious traders, embodying a code of mutual trust in alien environments. It also shows how deeply exploration and long-distance travel were embedded in Carthaginian life. Young merchants might return with tales of strange lands, enriching the oral culture and geographic knowledge of the populace. Now, what about funerals? Well, those customs in Carthage combined solemnity with artistry. The dead, especially the wealthy, were often interred in rock-cut family tombs outside the city, accompanied by jewelry, amulets inscribed in Punic, and fine-crafted goods. Carthaginians produced impressive sarcophagi for some burials. For example, the 4th century BC sarcophagus of a Carthaginian priest and priestess featured life-sized human figures carved on the lids, with serene expressions and stylized Egyptian-influenced poses. These show the care for preserving status and memory after death. An epitaph might invoke Tanit's blessing for the deceased's journey to the afterlife. But unlike the Romans, the Carthaginians did not practice elaborate public eulogies or ancestor masks, but they did maintain ancestor veneration, perhaps in a more private cult sense. As long as Carthage endured, the tomb of Dido was tended as a sacred site. In war, Carthaginians honored their dead and fallen heroes by monumental tombs. The Tophet itself, in a kind of grim way, was a continuous memorial garden for sacrificed children, each urn buried with the belief that that little life given would yield divine favor to protect the community. Morally, Carthaginian culture emphasized loyalty to kin and gods, cleverness in adversity, and endurance. The Roman historian Livy, though hostile, conceded that Hannibal exhibited virtus, that courage and skill, and a certain magnanimity alongside his notorious guile. We can extrapolate that the average Carthaginian prized success in survival, whether that was in business or war, and was less preoccupied with abstract virtues like honor as the Romans conceived it. A Carthaginian merchant or general was not above trickery if it achieved the desired end. Hence, the ambushes and ruses that Hannibal employed brilliantly. This practically permeated daily dealings as well. Marriage might be arranged to solidify clan alliances or trade partnerships, and indeed, Carthaginian nobles sometimes married into local Numidian royalty, as is the case in Sophonisba, daughter of a Carthaginian general, wed to King Syphax to secure an alliance. Such customs show a culturally sanctioned pragmatism. Family and state interests were deeply intertwined. Of course, Carthage's wealth and power were rooted in this robust economy, and above all, in maritime trade. Just like their Phoenician ancestors, the Carthaginians were intrepid sailors and savvy merchants. The city's strategic location in the central Mediterranean, with an excellent double harbor, allowed it to dominate key trade routes. The Carthaginian economy can be likened to a vast mercantile network radiating from Africa to Spain, to Italy, and beyond. They acted as the western pivot of Phoenician trade. From the Levant, they continued importing fine goods such as dyed textiles, that famous Tyrian cloth being one of them, and don't forget the glassware, luxury crafts, all of which they redistributed westward. Carthaginian merchants exported North African products, horses from Numidia, ivory and gold bought from the sub-Saharan region, salt and dyes, and of course agricultural produce. But they also traded heavily in metals. Southern Iberia, that is modern Spain, was rich in silver, copper, and tin. By the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Carthage controlled the Andalusian mining regions, either directly or via allied Iberian or Tartessian clients. As a result of that, tons of silver shipped east. One reason Carthaginian grew so rich was the proverbial Spanish silver that it acquired. Tin for making bronze was pretty rare. Carthaginians voyaged as far as the Atlantic Cassiterides, the Tin Islands, possibly Britain, to obtain it. According to later reports, the Carthaginians jealously guarded these Atlantic routes. One story tells of a Punic ship captain who, upon seeing a Roman vessel trailing him to learn the route of the secret tin source, deliberately grounded his ship on a shoal, sacrificing his cargo, but keeping the trade secret safe. The state reputedly repaid him for his losses, by the way, rewarding such loyalty to economic secrecy. The Carthaginian state both regulated and fostered trade. They negotiated treaties, like the one recorded by Polybius, the early Treaty of Carthage and Rome in 509 BCE, which delineated trade spheres. It restricted Romans from certain North African and Sardinian markets, and likewise Carthaginians from some Latin coasts, unless under certain conditions. The treaty shows Carthage's intent to monopolize the wealth of the western Mediterranean. Carthage enforced a kind of thalassocracy, that is, a rule of the sea. Its navy patrolled against pirates and unauthorized foreign traders. Even Greek merchants from rival cities like Massalia or Etruscans had to tread carefully in the Punic waters, and as a result, Carthage became the required intermediary for many goods. For example, West African gold and exotic products, like the skins of gorillas encountered by Hanno, found their way into Carthage and then to the broader Mediterranean market. The efficiency and fairness of Carthaginian trade practices are exemplified in Herodotus' accounts of their silent trade for gold on the Atlantic coast that we recounted before, and this reputation for reliable dealing, well, at least in commerce, made Carthaginian merchants warmly welcomed in ports throughout the ancient world. But what was a port like? Well, Carthage's harbour complex was an engineering marvel of antiquity. The city had two connected harbours, a rectangular commercial harbour for merchant ships, and adjacent to it a protected circular inner harbour reserved for the navy. This inner harbour had an island structure and a ringed docking bay reportedly sufficient enough to berth 220 warships, each in its own covered shed. A lofty harbour control tower crowned the central island, so that the Admiralty could observe the sea. Such sophisticated infrastructure speaks to the centrality of maritime trade. Goods from all over the world would be funneled into this commercial harbour, stored in warehouses, taxed, of course, and sold in Carthage's markets or re-exported. Carthaginian ships ranged from sturdy merchantmen to swift war galleys like triremes and quinquiremes. Punic shipbuilders were famed. The Romans admittedly learned and copied Carthaginian ship designs when they built their own navy. There is actually one humorous anecdote from the First Punic War, and that is that the Romans, inexperienced at sea, had to reverse engineer a Carthaginian quinquireme that had wrecked itself on an Italian shore, using it as a model to mass-produce ships, adding their own corvus boarding device to negate Carthage's naval skill, of course. Thus, Carthage was literally the trendsetter in naval technology and logistics at the time. While trade, of course, was the lifeblood, Carthage also enjoyed a thriving agricultural base in its African hinterland. The fertile plain of the Bagradas Valley and the surrounding countryside yielded abundant crops. Grains, olives, grapes, figs, pulses, and flax. They had it all. Carthage was adept at intensive farming, irrigating orchards, rotating crops, grafting fruit trees. The treatise of Margot, the father of farming, compiled agricultural wisdom into 28 books, covering everything from viticulture to beekeeping and the care of livestock. So when Carthage fell, the Roman Senate so valued this work that they took it on as their own. The knowledgeable senator D. Silanus in 146 BC took care of that. Under Carthaginian management, North Africa became a granary of sorts, even before Roman annexation. Carthage likely exported surplus grain to allies or used it to provision armies. Unlike Roman large estates worked by gangs of slaves, Carthaginian agriculture relied on local Berber tenant farmers or peasants under Punic supervision. Many Berber communities paid tribute in grain. The Roman writer Livy notes that Massinissa, a Numidian king, took advantage of Carthage's defeat in 201 to encroach on and seize some of these fertile lands, and that certainly indicates their value, of course. But Carthage was not just a trader of other people's goods, and it wasn't just an agricultural grower. It had its own industries too, and one of those industries was textile. The city produced fine embroideries and cloth. The dyeing industry was important too. Just like Tyre, Carthage had harvested murex shellfish to produce purple dye, and purple-dyed Punic textiles were luxury items in the Mediterranean. Carthaginian artisans were skilled in metalwork and jewelry making, as evidenced by intricate jewelry found in tombs, gold diadems, carnelian bead necklaces, etc. Of course, then you had ivory carving. That was another craft. They obtained ivory from trade caravans and carved prestige items, perhaps including decorative panels and figurines. Additionally, Carthage minted its own coinage from at least the 5th century BCE. By the latter period, Carthaginian coins, typically bearing the wreathed head of Tanit on one side and a horse or palm tree on the other, facilitated trade and, of course, troop payment. The imagery was symbolic. Tanit for divine protection, and the horse for the city's famed cavalry and mobility. These coins are found widely, indicating Carthaginian commercial reach and economic integration of its empire. Merchants and explorers of Carthage ventured into uncharted waters to find new resources. The voyages of Hanno down the West African coast, and Himilco toward Europe's Atlantic shores, possibly reaching Brittany or Britain. They were all state-sponsored missions to secure trade links and sources of precious commodities. Hanno's own report survives in a Greek translation and speaks of founding new colonies along the Moroccan coast, encountering savage people and volcanoes, and even those gorilla skins to bring back to Carthage. Such expeditions likely opened routes for gold from West Africa and tin from the north. The spirit of exploration is comparable to, if not exceeding, contemporary Greek voyages like those of Pythias. It shows an economic ethos. Carthaginians were willing to undertake long and perilous journeys, all for the sake of commerce and enrichment of the state. And in doing so, they expanded the geographical knowledge of the ancient world, albeit keeping much of it secret, as a kind of commercial state secret. Well, Carthage's economy differed from Rome's largely agrarian, land-based expansion. Where Rome colonized by settling soldier farmers on conquered land, Carthage colonized by establishing trading posts and exploiting resources, while usually leaving local societies intact, so long as they paid their tribute, of course. In this, Carthage was more akin to a Greek maritime power like Athens, which had an empire of allies and colonies and relied on sea trade for grain and goods. Athens and Carthage even clashed indirectly via Syracuse, and one can draw parallels. Both had strong navies and wealth from commerce. However, Carthage was more exclusively mercantile. Its citizens' body was not primarily made up of small farmers, as in many Greek polities or in early Rome, but of traders and landholders, directing the labor of subjugated peoples. This gave Carthage a formidable treasury, but also a vulnerability. If trade was disrupted, Carthage could starve or go bankrupt more quickly than a self-sufficient agrarian state would. There is many single points of failure. Indeed, during the long sieges of the Punic Wars, Rome tried to choke off Carthage's trade lifelines, while Carthage hired mercenaries to compensate for its smaller citizen army. Now what about taxation in Carthage? It primarily took the form of tribute from subject cities and peoples, duties on trade and port fees. The city had custom houses to tax imports and exports, and Carthaginian officials oversaw the weights and measures in the marketplace to ensure fairness and collect duties. Tribute from places like Libya or Numidia was often paid in kind, grain, elephants, etc. The elephants would certainly come in handy against the Romans, that's for sure. But Carthage also profited from the slave trade, capturing war prisoners, including many Iberians, Gauls, and later Romans, selling them off in the markets. Conversely, Carthage itself employed slaves, though perhaps in lesser proportions than the Romans, and many agricultural laborers were subjugated natives rather than chattel slaves slipped from afar. Well, let's have a look at some of the more gentler pursuits. You see, while Carthage was not as famed for high philosophy or fine arts as Alexandria or Athens, it certainly developed a rich artistic tradition, and it made its own notable contributions to knowledge, especially in more practical fields. Just ask the Romans where they got their ships from. Well, much of Carthaginian art and intellect was an amalgam of Phoenician heritage and the influences of the diverse cultures with which Carthage interacted. Because so many Punic literary works have been lost, often only known through later quotations, the Carthaginian intellectual world is the least understood aspect of its culture. But don't write it off completely. The hints that do survive are pretty intriguing. Let's start with art and architecture. Carthaginian art had a distinctive style, a blend of Egyptian, Near Eastern, and Hellenic motifs into something that became uniquely Punic. In sculpture, early Carthaginian works often followed Phoenician models, somewhat stiff figures with stylized features. The famous carved sarcophagi of Carthage from the 4th to 3rd century BCE show human figures in high relief on the lids, bearing subtle smiles and wearing detailed clothing and wigs reminiscent of Egyptian art. For example, the sarcophagus of the priestess from the Byrsa necropolis, now in the National Museum of Carthage, by the way, depicts a robbed woman with wing-like drapery, likely an image syncretizing local goddess iconography with classical form. It's works like this that illustrate how Carthaginians adopted Egyptian funerary iconography, perhaps via Phoenicia, long influenced by Egypt. The women have an Isis-like aspect, yet inscribe them with Punic identity. The inscriptions and context are indeed Punic. Another artifact type is the stele. Thousands of carved stone stele were erected in sanctuaries and tombs, often topped with the sign of Tanit, or a solar disk and crescent, and decorated with symbols like doves, palm trees, or priests in ritual pose. These stelae, while formulaic, show a keen eye for symbolic art, each compact expression of religious devotion through religious iconography. In terms of decorative arts, Carthage produced fine jewelry using gold granulation techniques and intricate designs, glass amulets and beads and ivory plaques carved with lotus and papyrus motifs. They also crafted pottery, including both utilitarian wares and red slip tableware. And interestingly, Punic pottery discovered in excavations sometimes imitates Greek forms, but with simpler, more geometric patterns, indicating how Carthaginians selectively appropriated Mediterranean art trends. In terms of architecture, early Carthage likely featured temples built in a Phoenician style, i.e. mud brick or stone with wooden pillars, perhaps a tripartite layout as a Phoenician Tyre building would look like. Well, later, Hellenistic influence led to more Greco-Roman looking structures. The Temple of Eshmun, for example, on the Birsa Hill, excavated in modern times, had a grand staircase and a colonnade that would not have been out of place in a contemporary Greek city. Yet, it likely housed distinctly Punic cult statues. Carthage's urban planning is evident by a regular street grid in some quarters, and houses with central courtyards, akin to Near Eastern and later Roman atrium houses. Mosaics found in Punic levels, though rare, and floor plaster patterns indicate an appreciation for geometric art in domestic spaces. One particularly impressive piece of engineering art was the city's defensive walls, massive stone fortifications, some sections reportedly 30 feet thick and 30 feet tall, with towers and bastions to match. Now these walls awed even the Romans, who had the tough job of besieging them in 146. The multi-level nature of Carthage's buildings, as mentioned, also implies architectural ingenuity in foundation and structural support. Six-story brick or stone buildings, they certainly require a careful load distribution. It is a pity that the Romans razed Carthage so thoroughly. Otherwise, we might have had to look at standing Punic monuments, the pleasure of doing so, those to rival Athens or Rome. But then again, perhaps that is one of the reasons why they had to raze it so thoroughly. Well, unlike the Greeks, Carthaginians did not leave behind treatises on philosophy or drama, or any epic poetry that we know of, unless there's some hiding under the ruins carved into tablets. Fingers crossed that there is. However, they were not illiterate in the arts of the mind. Their intellectual pursuits were often more scientific and pragmatic. For instance, the agricultural treatise of Margot, effectively an encyclopedic work on agronomy, covering viticulture, arboriculture, animal husbandry, and farm management. This suggests a scholarly approach to accumulating and systematizing knowledge for practical ends. Margot's work was later praised by Roman agronomists like Columella and Varro, who frequently cite the wisdom of the Carthaginian Margot on matters such as grafting fruit trees or curing diseases in livestock. In a way, we might even consider Margot as an intellectual equivalent of an ancient scientist, or at least an expert consultant. Geography and exploration was another important area of Punic intellectual contribution. The Periplus of Hanno stands as an important geographical text. In it, Hanno coolly describes coastal landmarks, rivers teeming with crocodiles and hippopotamus, encounters with various indigenous peoples, and even volcanic activity. He speaks of seeing fiery streams and a great mountain belching flame, which was most likely at the time Mount Cameroon. This account, while a travelogue, is a document of scientific curiosity, noting navigational distances, directions, and natural observations. It was cited by later geographers like Arrian. Similarly, reports from Himilco's Atlantic voyage contributed, albeit indirectly via later Greek writers, to the understanding of the Atlantic seas, mentioning tides, fog, and possibly a sighting of the British Isles. Another domain was language and law. Being a trade hub, Carthage must have developed complex commercial law and methods of accounting. They had a number system, and also used weights and measures compatible with other cultures. Bilingualism among the educated class meant that some Carthaginians wrote or corresponded in Greek. And indeed, after Carthage's fall, one notable Carthaginian immigrant, Clitomachus, born Hasdrubal, became a leading philosopher in Athens, heading the academy around 140 to 110 BCE. He wrote in Greek on philosophy, which shows that Carthaginians were certainly as capable as anyone else in engaging in the highest abstract debates, when given the opportunity to do so. While Clitomachus was left as a young man after Carthage's destruction, his success hints that Carthaginian elites were not strangers to Greek intellectual trends. They just did not leave any indigenous record due to language and cultural barriers. Similarly, in Roman Republican literature, the comic playwright Plautus, in his play Poenulus, concludes a character speaking Punic on stage, with lines intelligible as Punic language. Now this indicates that even Romans recognized Carthaginians had their own literature, or at least that their language was distinct and could be represented. In visual and performing arts, we have scant direct evidence. Did Carthage ever have any theatre? Well, possibly not in the Greek sense. There is no record of Punic plays or actors, however. They certainly had music. Flutes, lyres, drums, all used in religious festivals, and perhaps in more casual entertainment. They likely enjoyed dances. Carthaginian dances might have had a oriental flavor, with some influence from Egyptian or Berber tradition. There may have been oral literature, stories of Tyrian heroes, mythic tales of Melkart, or the founding saga of Dido, passed down through generations. Virgil's later romanticization of Dido in the Aeneid is a Roman poetic take on a Punic legend, but one wonders what the Carthaginian version was like. Some inscriptions indicate that historical chronicles were kept. For instance, one Punic text, mentioned by a later author, recorded a list of Carthaginian magistrates and events, much like the Roman annals. The Greeks mention a Carthaginian historian too, Philinus of Agrigentum, who wrote about the First Punic War from the Carthaginian side. And before you ask, yes, it's unfortunately lost. Now this suggests Carthage had its historians and archives. In fact, when Scipio Aemilianus oversaw Carthage's destruction, he ensured that important Carthaginian texts, such as treaties and historical records, were sent to Rome or preserved by local allies. Thus, Carthage was not an unwritten civilization. It had a literate class that documented treaties, trade contracts, laws, and perhaps even historical narratives. Coinage and iconography can also be seen as an artistic intellectual expression. The choice of Tanit's serene profile on coins, often wreathed with grain ears or adorned with a necklace alongside a horse or palm, conveyed messages, fertility and divinity, and of course Carthage's prowess. This visual language on coinage was a conscious cultural choice that asserted Carthaginian identity in a Hellenistic world where coins typically bore Greek gods, or at the time the likeness of Alexander. Carthage chose its own symbols, thereby intellectually branding itself via culture and currency. Finally, religion and philosophy. Carthaginians were deeply religious, as we have mentioned. They identified theology, well, not speculative in the Greek sense. It was all quite nuanced. Many of their gods had Greek equivalents, which implies that they engaged in interpretatio Graeca, an intellectual exercise of syncretism. For example, Carthaginians accepted the equation of Baal Hamon to Kronos, and of Tanit to a celestial Virgo or Juno Caelistis. In later centuries, under Roman rule, the Punic-speaking populace continued worshipping Tanit and Baal Hamon, just under different names. Tertullian in the 2nd century CE mentions that even in his day, people in the countryside still spoke Punic and used the term Baal for God. This continuity shows that Carthaginian religious thought proved to be resilient and adaptable, merging into a Romano-African context, but not disappearing. In terms of direct comparisons, where a Greek city might have dozens of philosophers and playwrights, Carthage had none that we know of. Their philosophers, a broad term, were navigators like Hanno, agronomists like Margo, and generals like Hannibal, who wrote memoirs of their campaigns. This reflects a culture oriented toward pragmatism and statecraft rather than abstract thought or artistic expression for its own sake. The Romans, despite vilifying Carthage, absorbed many of these Punic contributions. Roman agriculture was boosted by Punic knowledge, Roman geography by Punic exploration accounts, and even Roman military tactics evolved in response to Punic ingenuity. Culturally, one of the most interesting later outcomes was that some early Christian thought in North Africa might have been subtly colored by the Punic linguistic and cultural substratum, lending a unique flavor to African Latin rhetoric. Tertullian's fierce, pragmatic style could be seen as inheriting the no-nonsense Carthaginian tone, albeit just in a new form. So, what kind of conclusions can you draw? I think, if anything, we can say the Carthaginian culture, above all, was cosmopolitan and resilient. It was cosmopolitan in the way that it drew from a wide world, employing Iberian swordsmen, sailing with Egyptian amulets, writing in Phoenician, speaking Greek to negotiate treaties, and sacrificing to gods with roots in Canaan and local Libya alike. But it was resilient in the fact that despite military feats and foreign depictions as cruel and untrustworthy, they rebounded economically, and they always held fast to their identity. Of course, the fall of Carthage is a topic for a different video, but we will say that Scipio Aemilianus was reportedly seen weeping as he watched the city burn, reciting a line from Homer about the fall of Troy, and ominously reflecting that one day Rome might suffer the same fate. Of course, today Rome is not a ruin, I suppose. But, well, it certainly went through its hard times. Anyway, a new video about the Punic War coming up soon, and a general history of Carthage. What I want to do is have a history of Carthage before the Punic Wars. Now that is a video coming soon. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure over this hour and a quarter to talk about the culture and the little eccentricities of the Carthaginians. So let me thank my top-tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfadnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Davry, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Babonic, Nicholas, Craig, and Neftis. Thank you so much. Well, that is it from me. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned a lot. Or I hope you just had a good rest while listening. Either way, mission accomplished. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to all of you, all around the world, and I will see you whenever you feel like returning. You know I'll always be here. Good night, and farewell.